So if you've just watched Chris Nolan's The New Odyssey movie, or if you have been getting interested in Greek mythology, I have a whole stack of Greek mythology retellings set during the Odyssey itself and its prequel poem, the Iliad, for you to dig into. Now, I should say just right off the bat, I am not going to be covering all Greek mythology retellings in this. It would take forever. We're not going to be talking about gods and goddesses and their stories. We're not going to be talking about heroes like Hercules or Theseus or Perseus. We are going to be specifically focusing in on the time period of the Trojan War and the immediate after effects as they relate to Odysseus. Both these stories are epic poems written by Homer. And it's important to remember when you're talking about Greek mythology, and especially these two, which feel very much grounded, they feel like history, that this is mythology and it's not history. It does, some would argue, sometimes have some moments that we could pick out as possibly having happened, but by and large, there is no one true version of these events. And modern day authors who are retelling these stories, reinterpreting them, taking the characters and putting their own spins on them with the lived experiences that they have or that our society has, and tackling issues from our current society through these stories, is exactly the same thing that ancient Greek storytellers were doing. Yes, Homer's version of the Iliad and the Odyssey and Odysseus is the one that has stood the test of time and made it through, but that's partly just due to survivor bias. There would have been other versions of this story, of these characters going about at the same time. And these modern interpretations, whether we like the changes they make or not, are every bit as valid as the source material. That's not to say that I am a great fan of the costuming choices that it seems are being made in this new Odyssey movie, but that's a completely different issue. We'll start off with who Odysseus is. He is an important player in the Iliad, and he is the titular character of the Odyssey. By the time we reach the Odyssey, he is the king of a small island kingdom called Ithaka. He is married to Penelope and he has a son called Ptolemaeus. Odysseus is a distant descendant of Hermes, the god of thieves and travellers and liars. And he is a favoured champion of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and battle strategy. And I think together that gives you a really good sense of who Odysseus generally tends to be as a character. Some interpretations will paint him as kinder and more benevolent. He's a genius, a strategician, he's a pragmatist. And others will take a slightly more shrewd look at him. He's cunning, he's sneaky, he can be very manipulative. Now, when it comes to reading about Greek mythology, there are two, I would say, types of books. We have the ones that tell you this happened and then this happened and then this happened. They really follow the plot lines and the events without really giving you too much insight into individual characters. They're great for getting a really good sense of the story overall and for that historical feel of almost reading a textbook or an account of an event that happened. Then we have far more character-driven stories. These are ones that put us into the headspace of one of the participants. They give us the motives, they give us the emotions that the author imagines the character feeling at that time. Personally, those are my favourite type of retellings, ones where once you know the events, you can go ham and play about with the reasoning why and the impact that it would have on individuals. So the books I'm going to talk about will tend to fall into that camp more. And because of just my own reading taste, they're also going to tend to be more queer positive and more feminist. If you do though want to just give yourself a really broad outline of Greek mythology as a whole and the Iliad and the Odyssey, you really can't go wrong with Robert Graves' The Greek Myths. This is like the granddaddy of these books. It's the one that everyone tends to use as a starting point. And it is good, it's really comprehensive. It has a slightly more academic tone. And because it was written in the 50s, it has maybe a slightly drier writing style than we would be looking for nowadays. But it is a really good starting point. If you look into any of the acknowledgements for most new mythology retellings, they're probably going to credit Graves as at least one of the books they used. To get that same overview but with a more modern voice to it, I think your best bet might be Stephen Fry's Great Mythology Quartet. It features mythos, which deals with the gods and the creation myths, heroes, which deals with people like Hercules and Theseus, as we talked about, and then the two that are relevant to this video, Troy and the Odyssey. The tone of these books is still that of an educator or a parent bringing this information to you rather than immersing you in the story, but I do think you get a little bit more of that wry humour coming through that Stephen Fry is known for. I haven't listened to them as audiobooks, but I know Fry does a lot of narration, so I suspect that that might be a good way to tackle these. And then finally, this one is very specific, so it's not going to be for everyone, but I personally really like The Feminist Companion to Mythology by Carolyne Larrington. This covers not just Greek mythology, European mythology, but also goes into Eastern mythologies and African, South American. There's lots in it, but it is more like an encyclopedia or a dictionary. You'll get maybe a paragraph or a couple of sentences about some of the characters involved, explaining who they are and how they are relevant to feminism then and now. It's not something I would see a lot of people reading cover to cover, but it is something that's nice to have on hand if you are delving into mythology in a more general way and want to be able to reference where you've heard of someone before and what other stories they might play a part in. Now, Odysseus' story starts actually before the Odyssey in Homer's The Iliad. The Iliad is literally translated to the story of Troy, and it is all about this great 10-year war. We begin many years before the war kicks off, when Odysseus is still a young unmarried prince, and along with basically every other man or every other rich titled man in Greece decides to vie for the hand of Helen. She is the most beautiful woman in the world, she is a demigod, she's the daughter of Zeus, and the contest to win her hand is impressive. Sensing that no matter who wins Helen in the end, there could be some bad blood coming from this courtship, Odysseus is the one to suggest that all of the potential suitors make a bargain. No matter who Helen marries, if in the future anyone tries to take her from her rightful husband, all of the suitors will band together to defend that marriage. This doesn't win Helen's hand. She goes to Menelaus, one of the really powerful Greek kings, and Odysseus goes back, marries Penelope, gets himself set up on Ithaka. Our story jumps to a hillside near the walled city of Troy. We have three goddesses vying for a golden apple that bears the inscription "for the most beautiful." Now, anyone who knows anything about any kind of mythology knows that you do not want to come to the attention of the gods. It generally ends really, really badly. But these goddesses need someone to decide who is the most beautiful and who gets this really shiny, lovely apple. They bring in Paris. He is a prince of Troy that, for reasons that happen before the story, is currently working as a shepherd. Each of the goddesses, Hera, Aphrodite and Athena, make their case and offer Paris some kind of incentive to choose them. He goes with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and his prize is the hand, the heart, the everything of the most beautiful woman in the world. If you're interested in how this story, the Apple of Discord or Strife, feeds into the Olypmpians and into Greek mythology more generally, then a really nice place to start would be George O'Connor's Olympian series. These are graphic novels, so they are really, really accessible. I personally really like the illustration style. It's a 12-book series and each one focuses on a different Olympian god. The issues themselves aren't really chronological. What they do is select certain events, certain myths that are directly related to that god or goddess and present them from their point of view. For the Apple of Discord, the story you're looking for comes in volume 6, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. These two little events are now going to come together in a clash. Paris and Helen run off together, and Menelaus calls in that pact that all the other suitors made. Helen quite literally becomes the face that launches 1,000 ships, and one of these suitors dragged against his will and despite his protests to fight at Troy is Odysseus. Troy is a fortress city and basically impenetrable, despite the fact that Menelaus and his allies are a massively more powerful force. Troy manages to hold out for 10 years under siege, and there are some really great books and stories happening in that decade. This is where we meet heroes like Hector, Achilles, Ajax, and the Amazons. If you only read one book based on Greek mythology, and especially set during the Iliad, I would recommend The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. It is a classic almost at this stage in its own right, and well deservedly. I think what I like about Miller's telling is that she really grasps the concept of a Greek tragedy. The story is inevitable, you know it's not going to end well, and yet there's something bittersweet about the journey to get there. It's written in just lyrical prose, it's really immersive, and it delivers a beautifully tragic love story without being a category romance. In this one, we are following the lifetime of Achilles, one of the great heroes of Greek mythology with his one great weakness. The story is told to us by his lover, Patroclus, and it's a very nice view of an iconic character through the eyes of someone that loves him. You definitely get to see Achilles in a really positive, benevolent light, and also you get to see some of the character flaws that you would get to know if you you also get to see some of the character flaws he has presented in the nicest way possible through the eyes of someone who wants to see him in his best light. I think this book deserves every award that it's got. I think the writing is just lush and lyrical and beautiful, but I do know that some people maybe aren't going to enjoy that style of writing and might want something a little more direct. The other book I would recommend that is happening outside of the Trojan walls is a really nice contrast or companion piece to The Song of Achilles. This is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. This follows Briseis, who is a queen in her own right, but as Agamemnon's armies move across the landscape, her city is sacked and she turns from a queen into a captive and slave. Like so many of the other women that this army conquers, she becomes what I think we would politely call a comfort woman or a concubine, and she is specifically given to Achilles. So in this, we obviously get a very different viewpoint of Achilles and of what is going on in that Greek camp outside of the walls. Briseis is incredibly important to the Iliad and yet rarely gets featured in a starring role. It is Achilles' sort of ownership of Briseis that leads him to argue with Agamemnon, who is Menelaus's brother, and ultimately starts the snowball effect that leads to so many of the really well-known high points of the Iliad. I personally wasn't a huge fan of Pat Barker's writing style, but I did like what she was trying to do with this, really giving a voice to a lot of the women that are forgotten about. It is the first book in a trilogy, so if you enjoy this one, you could follow Briseis' story through the women of Troy and the voyage home. For a book that is going to take you inside of those walls into the city of Troy under siege, I recently read and really enjoyed The End Crowns All by Bea Fitzgerald. Our protagonist is Cassandra, one of the princesses of Troy. She's blessed with the gift of prophecy by the god Apollo, and then cursed when she rejects his sexual advances to have these prophecies never be believed. Fitzgerald is looking at what happens when you can see this horrific future coming down the tracks upon you and everyone you love, but no one will believe you about it and there's nothing you can do to stop it. We also get a really nicely feminist look at how women tend not to be believed, how they are told they're overreacting, and I guess what you would do if everyone you loved thought you were either a liar, an attention seeker, or going mad. This is a sapphic story and we also get to see some of it through Helen's point of view. Helen in so many retellings and versions of mythology is absolutely villainized as being shallow and even potentially cruel because so much death and destruction happens in her name. But Fitzgerald really takes that and analyses it here and asks how much control Helen would have had in a world where the gods have a plan in mind and are able to move pieces into place as they see fit. Towards the end of this book, it goes even a bit more speculative. It's not a direct retelling of the mythology. It takes the idea of what if these women are able to work together, would knowing the future give them any control over changing it? I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a really easy read. Fitzgerald does keep, even in this historical setting, a relatively modern way of speaking, which can be a little bit jarring, but I think makes it feel quite pacey and engaging. Now, the last book that I would talk about in this section really combines those type of stories I was talking about at the beginning, saying that some focus on the events in a broad scale and some go quite deeply into specific characters. Natalie Haynes manages to do both in 1,000 Ships, and I think this is a fantastic place to come in if you're looking for something entry level, and I think this would be a fantastic book to give you a really broad but emotionally impactful version of the Iliad. She takes a really broad range of female characters and gives each of them a chapter or a couple of chapters to tell their story. We don't get to spend an entire book with Cassandra or Penelope, but we get a couple of chapters from their point of view, as well as lots of other women that are generally forgotten about. We get to see it from the point of view of high-ranking princesses, low-ranking goddesses, and women that in the original source material don't even get names, they are just the wife of. This is one of not just my favourite books in Greek mythology, but one of my favourite books. I really love the way Haynes dips in and out of these different characters and gives you a real impression of the destruction that war causes, not in the battlefield necessarily, but the way the ripple effects of it can affect the entire continent, and the way that women specifically are either able or unable through the social constructs at the time to make a difference or make their voices heard. As Haynes says in her acknowledgements, Homer's Iliad is rightly regarded as one of the great foundational texts on war and warriors, men and masculinity, but it is fascinating how we have received that text and interpreted the story it tells us. She mentions that she gave the book to a friend to critique, and he questioned the book's basic premise, that the women who survive or don't survive a war are equally as heroic as their menfolk. The men go and fight, the women don't, was his essential argument. But the women do fight, not least the Amazons, even if the poems heralding their great deeds have been lost. The men don't always. Achilles doesn't fight until book 18 of the 24-book Iliad, yet we never question that he is a hero. Even when he isn't fighting, his status as a warrior is never in doubt. I hope that at the end of this book, my attempt to write an epic, readers might feel that heroism is something that can reside in all of us, particularly if circumstances push it to the fore. It doesn't belong to men, even any more than the tragic consequences of war belong to women. Survivors, victims, perpetrators, these roles are not always separate. I think 1,000 Ships is a really nice bridge between the Iliad and the events at Troy and the Odyssey. Our story at Troy finally ends when a smart young man, Odysseus, comes up with a cunning plan. The Greeks dismantle one of their ships and build it into a massive wooden horse. They pull back all their forces and they leave the horse as a gift on the beach. The Trojans bring the horse into the city, and in the night, soldiers spill out from inside. They open the gates and the Greeks flood in to sack the city. In the aftermath, the spoils, the women, the treasure are divvied up, and the Greeks return to their long abandoned homes. Now, the journey from Troy to Ithaka is not that far, but Odysseus manages to anger the wrong gods and hit the worst run of luck in pretty much literary history. After spending 10 years fighting at Troy, it takes him another 10 years to get home. And that story is the Odyssey. If you want to actually read the Odyssey itself, there are lots of different translations that you can pick up. I personally really like Emily Wilson's version. It's relatively recent and it is the first time that a woman has taken the translation. One of the fascinating things about reading Wilson's version is the way that translation and words can actually shape our interpretation of events. One of my favourite kind of ways that this comes through is in the story of the women that are on Ithaka with Penelope. In the original Greek text, these are referred to as the girls or the female ones, but in older versions of translations by men in very patriarchal societies, there was often a judgment put on these women because they did sleep with the suitors that were there to try and marry Persephone. There was very much a moral judgment put upon these women who were almost seen as traitors. They were loose women, and they were quite often translated as either sluts or whores, despite the fact that that's never used in the Greek text. She takes out some of that misogyny that has been added after the fact, and I think gives us, yes, a more feminist, but also a more literal version of Homer's tale. She uses terms like the slaves or the girls instead of the servants and the maids to show that these women had a lack of agency at the point when these events are happening. And the changing of this language then affects the way we see the events and the ultimate fate that happens to these women. The Odyssey is, though, obviously a very long, epic story, but if the Odyssey itself isn't for you, there are definitely some other options out there. I personally haven't found a novel which I think covers the entire journey in a really compelling or effective way. One that I do think does it well and is a little bit more accessible because it's another graphic novel is The Odyssey by Gareth Hinds. This has a really beautiful watercolour style illustration to it that I really like, and it's a really nice way of getting the full story in its broad strokes before you decide to delve deeper into the motivations of what are, more so I would say in this than the Iliad, very complex characters. Another option is maybe a little bit more left field. Would be Percy Jackson and the Sea of Monsters, the second book in Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson and the Olypmpians series. This is a middle grade series that takes Greek mythology and gives it a much more modern and much more comedic middle grade style. The Sea of Monsters isn't a direct retelling of the Odyssey, and it's not trying to be, but in this book Percy does cover some of the same ground as Odysseus. We do get to see some of the characters from Odysseus's journey pop up here. We have Scylla, Charybdis, Circe, Polyphemus and the Sirens. As with a lot of the characters in Rick Riordan's work, they all get a bit of a modern twist to them. Circe, for instance, is running a day spa. It's maybe not going to give you the Odyssey itself, but it is a really nice way of taking some of those characters and seeing them in a fresh light. For another in-depth look at a particular character, Madeline Miller makes a second appearance on this list. This is Circe. This follows a demigoddess who has a lot of kind of sorceress type powers in her own right. Most mythology before this would paint Circe as very much a villain, but this lets her tell her own story. We get to see at one point Odysseus and his men arrive on her island, and we get to see how events where she is the antagonist in the Odyssey play out differently when we are looking at it through her eyes. I have noticed that people who tend to really enjoy the Song of Achilles don't tend to get on as well with Circe, and vice versa. I think the writing style in this is a little bit more straightforward, it's a little less purpley, and I know that's definitely going to work for some people where the Song of Achilles doesn't. So I think they're both good. I did prefer Achilles, but this is definitely a solid story. Again, it's won loads of awards, it regularly comes out on top lists, and I think it's a really good one to let you immerse yourself in that kind of Greek world. The last section of the Odyssey deals with Odysseus arriving home to Ithaka. While he's been away, Penelope has been ruling their kingdom and in the past couple of years been besieged with suitors. Odysseus has been away for nearly 20 years at this point, and everyone is telling her that it's time to just accept that he's died and pick a new husband to rule the kingdom. Penelope is smart though, and together with her maidservants, she comes up with a distraction, something to buy time. She says that before she can possibly consider remarrying, she has to weave the death shroud for her father-in-law, who happens not to be dead at this point. She and her servants work on the shroud during the day, but each night she sits and unpicks as much of the day's work as she can, meaning that it makes very, very slow progress. However, while that's happening, the suitors are eating her out of house and home and generally being the world's worst house guests. And it all comes to a head when Odysseus finally returns. I've read a few stories that tell Penelope's story, both during the Iliad, the Odyssey, and in that last section. But I think my favorite so far has been Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad. This is very short. It's less than 200 pages, so that's always fun. It's also got a unique format. We hear from Penelope in the first person, but we also hear from the Greek chorus, a Greek chorus of her maidservants in verse telling their side of the story. Like so many of Margaret Atwood's books, this does have a really heavy feminist focus. It looks at the way that Penelope's life is constrained by her gender. We talk about arranged marriages and how much control she's able to exert when she becomes Odysseus's wife in a home that's not hers. But it also looks at the maid servants, the girls that we've talked about before, and questions how much agency they have even in relation to Penelope. As well as that Greek chorus in verse, there are also a couple of sections here that work like court transcripts where Odysseus, Penelope, the maids, the suitors are all taking part in a trial in front of a judge and history is being examined. It's a really unique tale with a lot of voice that really sets on its head who our heroes and villains might be. Now, I actually haven't read Claire North's Ithaka yet, but I know Penelope at the Paperback Cat has and really enjoyed the trilogy, so I'll link to her channel in the description below. This is on the top of my TBR. This is giving Penelope the chance to tell her story without the bells and whistles and gimmicks that Margaret Atwood uses admittedly very well. This is going to be something that can feel more like an actual history, and I'm really looking forward to it. This is the Songs of Penelope series, and after Ithaka we have The House of Odysseus and The Last Song of Penelope. I have read the first chapter and I really liked Claire North's writing style, but I need to get back to it. The last book I'm going to bring up is actually a non-fiction and doesn't actually cover the events of the Odyssey or the Iliad. It's another one from Natalie Haynes, who is actually a classicist in her own right as well as an author, and this is Pandora's Jar. My favourite thing with history and mythology is always seeing these characters or these people and how the media or culture portrays them over time. The way they're presented and what we think of them changes to fit in with the society that is using them for a purpose. That's my thing. So this is exactly what Haynes does in this book. She takes a selection of goddesses and female characters from Greek myth, and she looks at the way their image has been used and how it has changed and evolved, and how our perception of these characters is influenced by what the people telling these stories or using their images are trying to portray. She takes 10 individual women and gives them a real deep dive, what the original Greek mythology tells us about them, when and how they've appeared in various films, television shows, marketing, and how they are being twisted or shown in different lights through the passage of time. The ones that would be relevant to the stories we've been talking about would be Penelope, obviously, and to a lesser extent Clytemnestra and the Amazons. So those are all the books I have for you, but there are also a couple of films and television shows that might be fun to dip your toe into. We've already talked about Percy Jackson and the Sea of Monsters. There is a film version of that book, which I don't think is as bad as everyone makes out, okay? But there's also the newer Disney Plus television show, and Sea of Monsters is the entirety of season 2. There are some changes made in the show versus the book, some pretty important motivational changes for a pretty important character, but none of that has anything to do with the events that are kind of mimicking the Odyssey. So if that's why you're there, I don't think it'll bother you in any way. I personally have been loving this TV adaptation of the books, getting to really have 8 hours rather than cramming it all into one film. I think the most obvious film to mention here is Troy from 2004. This is a big budget, glitzy Hollywood blockbuster starring Brad Pitt as Achilles, Eric Bana as Hector, and Orlando Bloom as Paris. It was very much a vehicle for Brad Pitt at the kind of height of his Hollywood power, if you like, and it's everything you would think that that would be. The women are at best cardboard cutouts, and any queer content is stomped into the ground. This is very much about the battle scenes and the golden armour, and Achilles as that mythological level Greek hero. I did really like, though, their casting of Odysseus. We have Sean Bean, who I actually think pulls off a kind of quieter version of Odysseus, more that thinker and strategist side of him rather than the cunning and playful side, but he pulls it off really well, and I personally find it hilarious that Sean Bean, who dies in absolutely everything, in a film that has such a high body count, is one of the few characters to make it out alive. The film covers the events purely of the Iliad. We don't dip into the Odyssey, but you could probably treat it as a prequel. Through 70s were really keen on what were called sword and sandal epics, and they adapted a lot of mythology and ancient history for those films. The one that is probably the most relevant here would be the 1955 film Ulysses with Kirk Douglas. Ulysses is the Latin version of Odysseus. The characters are somewhat two-dimensional, and the events tend to be quite shallowly shown. They tend to be moved about as needed. It's definitely a vibe and an inspired by rather than a direct adaptation, but it wins out in the production values. This is very much golden age Hollywood, and you can see the money on screen. There are some beautiful, if entirely historically inaccurate costumes. There are some absolutely stunning set piece designs, and the whole thing just has a really fairy tale-like magical quality to the story. The other one that I would throw in here is the 1997 miniseries slash movie, depending on where you watch it, The Odyssey. This one, is it good? No. But I do have a real fondness for it. I think what this and Ulysses have that some of the other adaptations don't have is that these aren't like Percy Jackson, they aren't aimed at adults. They keep some of that real fantasy elements of mythology without being ashamed of them. We're not trying to make this a history. We're not trying to make this a true story, a history. This still has magic and monsters and sorcery, and it embraces that, and I enjoy that. And I feel like we lose something when we try to go too grim and gritty and grounded, forgetting that it's not actually history that we're looking at. This also has quite a good cast who are clearly having a great time. We have Christopher Lee as Tyreus, we have Vanessa Williams as Calypso, and my personal favourite, because she hams it up so well, is Bernadette Peters as Circe. If Odyssey has the vibe that I suspect it's going to, the film that I think is the most like-for-like comparison, though, is from just 2024, The Return, starring Ralph Fiennes as Odysseus. This definitely is sticking with that no magic, historical, grim and gritty version, but it only tackles the very last section of the Odyssey. We start when Odysseus lands on Ithaka, and the whole movie is that final section. Now, cinematography on this one's a bit rough. It looks like a made-for-TV movie, but I absolutely have to give it. The performances are incredibly impressive. In terms of casting, I think Ralph Fiennes just is a far more believable Odysseus, especially this kind of older Odysseus, than I can possibly imagine Matt Damon being. But also he's Ralph Fiennes, and he gives a really compelling look at a man who's been at war for 10 years, suffered all the indignities of the Odyssey, and finally arrived home, a kind of broken and damaged creature. We also have Penelope in this, played by Juliette Binoche, and again, she just gives a really standout performance as someone who has sacrificed everything again and again and again, and all the damage that does. I'm not sure it's a film I would ever watch again, but I did think it did something very interesting. And then the last TV film is, again, in that left field. This is Class of the Titans. It is a cartoon series from, I think, 2006. And it's basically Percy Jackson the series before we had Percy Jackson the series. This follows a group of young people who all just so happen to be modern day descendants of different Greek heroes. They are taken to a specialised school and they are trained to fight Kronos, who's trying to take over the world. Because it's a kids' cartoon series from this era, each episode really stands on its own, although there is an overarching plotline, and half the fun is, a bit like with Percy Jackson, getting to play spot the mythological cameo and seeing how they've chosen to interpret the different characters. The one that is most relevant here is one of our main cast. This is Odie, who is the descendant of Odysseus, and he's their kind of tech guru strategist. Finally, if you want something completely different, it's not exactly TV or film, but you could listen to or watch Epic the Musical. This is a studio concept album musical, so you can't actually see it performed anywhere, but it was at one point really huge on TikTok. You've probably seen little snippets from some of the songs from some really big creators. It was at one point everywhere, and the songs are real earworms. It's really catchy. You can either obviously listen to it on its own, or there is a animated version of the entire thing available for free on YouTube. Let me know if any of these books take your fancy. If not, leave me some kind of ocean themed emoji to show you we're here. As I said at the beginning, there are loads of different elements and stories within Greek mythology, and this has really only dealt with those 2 poems from Homer. If you want other videos, maybe looking at the Olypmpians themselves, the stories of the gods, or heroes like Hercules and Perseus, or some books that look at some of those really underrepresented women, then let me know and I can try and put some kind of video together on that. Thank you for watching. I really hope I'm going to see you in future videos. Goodbye.